Yeah, we've got Adam Scavone. David Rice is a simpler name, but I shouldn't say anything, right? Stephen Gutowski. I don't think that's
right.
That's
Fogleman
much harder
over here
than any of our members' names in there. Yeah. But he's got a good question about the latest on the legal drama surrounding cannabis and firearms. There was actually a recent filing by the DOJ in a fairly interesting case, at least politically, out of Florida that was filed by Nikki Fried, who, she went in the primary against DeSantis. Anyway, she's the agricultural commissioner there, in Florida, for some strange old political reason, that's the office that controls concealed carry permitting in the state. I'm sure there was some sort of very interesting story behind why that got moved to that department at some point in Florida history. But regardless, she filed suit to try and invalidate the federal prohibition on marijuana users owning firearms, at least the ones that have a medical marijuana license or card or what have you. So in that case, DOJ just filed a brief that essentially said they disagree with the recent federal appeals court case that found this prohibition is unconstitutional generally. And obviously this has gotten some discussion surrounding Hunter Biden, his potential gun charge, which seems more likely than ever to happen because of his plea deal blowing up. But yeah, so there's some interesting stuff to talk about here with the latest on these cases. It sure seems like this prohibition is having a very hard time surviving the Bruin standard.
Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty safe bet that the federal court system is casting a very skeptical eye, especially under this new Bruin standard of, not just weed, but you're seeing all sorts of controlled substances cases kind of work their way through the lower federal courts. We've had a couple of district federal courts. One in Oklahoma was about weed, but another one that we've covered in Texas was about more than weed. There was some magic mushrooms involved. There was methamphetamine involved. So the whole controlled substances space doesn't seem to survive strict scrutiny because, historically, there were some prohibitions on using your guns while actively intoxicated, for example. A lot of times it was like you can't show up to your militia muster while being drunk. Right. So that's a pretty good analog for, you can't have a gun while you're high or something. But a lot of the courts are coming to the conclusion that there's really no historical federal law about if you've ever drank alcohol or something, you can't own a gun. And that's sort of where these cases are withering on the vine in the federal court system. So I think it's fair to say that the courts are casting a skeptical eye sort of as the political environment is also shifting towards greater acceptance of at least marijuana. We have 20 something states now that have legalized it recreationally, another 30 to 40 that have legalized it medically. And so I think it's a fascinating time for not just the legal cases, but to see them collide with the political realities. It's sort of an interesting time for this space.
Yeah, you also saw the same basic argument pop up in that Hawaii sensitive places case when they were.
That's right.
The judge was talking about carrying in restaurants that serve alcohol. This is sort of the same throughput. A lot of these cases, and that's kind of the nature of Bruin. Because a lot of these cases are going to rely on the same laws because there weren't that many regulations. Obviously, there were gun regulations, but a lot of them, they weren't as numerous as they are today, certainly. And so a lot of them are going to come up in a lot of these different circumstances. You also saw this, by the way, and I wrote a whole analysis piece on this for members. But this shows up in the government's case, their brief in Rahimi, in the domestic violence restraining order case, as a warning to the Supreme Court about how expansive the effects could be if they go with the Fifth Circuit's reasoning, if they go with the Fifth Circuit's interpretation of Bruin in the Rahimi case, because that's already led to, for instance, drug users, at least marijuana users, being kept from or being allowed to keep their firearms, striking down this law. So I'm getting a little bit put together on it, but that came up in that scenario as well.
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of goes to another analysis piece. And we've talked about this several times in the past about just broadly setting the parameters of who is covered under the Second Amendment, particularly in the context of this new test. Because we now kind of have the what's covered. We don't have it fully fleshed out, but we at least have, you can't ban handguns. It's this common instrument of self-defense. And Heller said, you can't ban those. Same thing with carry. We said, we established where you can carry in public. And we just don't really have a great idea of who just yet. And obviously Rahimi will, depending on how narrowly or broadly they decide to rule, will at least whittle away a little bit and give us a better idea of who can be prohibited from owning guns. And that should give us a little bit more indication of some of these marijuana cases that our member brings up here.
Yeah, I think that'll give us the beginning of the who. I mean, I still think we're kind of at the beginning of all the who, what, and where questions.
Yeah.
They're still going to need to flush out all of that stuff under Bruin. And so I would, we talked about how they're not likely to take 5 Supreme Court Second Amendment cases each year or whatever, but I do think they're going to have to take Second Amendment cases more frequently than they have in the past just to flush out all these questions.